The morning his mistress was supposed to leave the country pregnant with his child. My phone was the only thing in the house that didn't look surprised. At 5:30 in the morning, before the sun rose over Chicago, I was already awake. Not because I was anxious. Not because I was heartbroken. I was awake because I like numbers in their quietest state. Numbers don't lie at dawn. They sit still. They wait to be read. Daniel thought I was asleep when he rolled his suitcase down the hallway. He had practiced that walk for weeks, careful, measured, pretending this was just another early flight for a consulting opportunity in Toronto. He had kissed my forehead the night before like a man who believed he was generous. He thought I didn't know about Natalie. He thought I didn't know she was pregnant. He thought I didn't know he had booked 2 one-way tickets out of O'Hare. What he didn't know was that 3 months earlier, I had noticed a recurring transfer labeled consulting travel to a Florida account that had nothing to do with architecture. And what he really didn't know was that when you move money across borders using a joint account, you leave fingerprints. I heard the front door close softly. Then my phone vibrated. Transaction attempt declined. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just picked up my coffee and waited for the next call. I am Nicole Harper, 32 years old. Business restructuring consultant. I fix companies that are bleeding cash but don't yet know where the wound is. For years, I believed my marriage was not a wound. Daniel Harper, 35. Architect. Talented. Charismatic when he wanted to be. Frustrated more often than he admitted. When we married, I was already out-earning him. By our 3rd year together, I was managing multi-million-dollar turnaround projects, while he was still pitching mid-level residential developments that rarely made it past proposal stage. I told myself income differences didn't matter. I told myself partnership wasn't about ego. I told myself love was an equalizer. What I didn't account for was how fragile male pride can become when measured against spreadsheets. The first sign wasn't lipstick or perfume. It was silence. Daniel began protecting his phone like it contained state secrets. He started going to the gym twice a day. He laughed differently, lighter, almost boyish. And he stopped asking about my work. The financial trail started small. $2,000. Then 3. Then 5. Always tagged as travel expenses. Always routed through a vendor name I didn't recognize. I didn't confront him. I pulled statements. I cross-referenced timestamps. I checked corporate registries. The vendor didn't exist. What did exist was Natalie Brooks, 28, elementary school teacher, soft smile, patient eyes, the kind of woman who makes insecure men feel exceptional. I found her the way I find inefficiencies, through pattern deviation. Her name appeared as an emergency contact on a clinic invoice mistakenly forwarded to Daniel's secondary email, which still synced to our shared cloud. Estimated due date. That was the moment everything shifted. Not because of jealousy. Not even because of betrayal. Because pregnancy meant permanence. And permanence meant planning. I didn't confront Daniel that night. I made dinner. I asked about his client in Toronto. I watched him lie with the confidence of someone who thinks he's 2 steps ahead. He wasn't. Over the next week, I reconstructed his exit strategy. Lease agreement for a furnished condo in Toronto. 6-month term. Immigration consultation invoice discussing temporary residency. 2 one-way tickets departing within days. He wasn't escaping emotion. He was relocating liability. The plan was simple. Move Natalie abroad before the baby was born. Establish residence outside immediate jurisdiction. File for divorce once settled. Transfer enough marital funds to secure a clean start. What he forgot was that the money he was moving wasn't just his. It was ours. And legally, that distinction matters. The forged signature was almost impressive. Clean. Convincing. Nearly mine. He had authorized a larger wire transfer 3 weeks ago, and my name sat neatly at the bottom of the document. I never signed it. That's when I stopped thinking like a wife and started thinking like an analyst. I called my attorney quietly. I hired a forensic accountant discreetly. I learned exactly how financial compliance systems flag cross-border fund movement tied to joint accounts under investigation. I didn't ask anyone to hold Natalie's passport. I simply ensured the investigation was documented before departure. By the time Daniel believed he had secured his future, every system he depended on was recalculating. The first call came at 6:12 in the morning. I let it ring. The second call came 30 seconds later. Then a text. "What did you do?" I looked at the notification and set the phone face down on the counter. For years, Daniel believed I was the stable one, the reasonable one, the forgiving one. He mistook composure for weakness. What he never understood is that I don't shout when I discover a problem. I document it. And when I remove something from my life, I don't slam the door. I lock it. By the time the sun fully rose over Chicago that morning, my marriage wasn't collapsing. It was being audited. By the time Daniel came home that night, he was no longer pretending. He walked in without his suitcase. That was the first thing I noticed. His shoulders were tight, jaw set, eyes scanning the room as if something might have physically changed while he was gone. I was at the kitchen island, laptop open, reviewing a client restructuring proposal worth more than the condo he had secretly leased in Toronto. "You did this," he said. Not hello, not explanation. Accusation. "I did what?" I asked, not looking up immediately. My cards were declined. Natalie was stopped at passport control. They said there's a financial compliance review. "That's not random." I closed my laptop slowly and met his eyes. "It's not random," I agreed. For a second, he looked confused, as if he hadn't expected honesty. "I didn't stop you from flying," I said calmly. "I stopped you from moving joint funds under a forged signature." The word hung in the air between us. Forged. He exhaled sharply. "I didn't forge anything. You authorized a wire transfer 3 weeks ago with my name attached to it," I said. "I was in a board meeting in Boston at the exact time it was processed. There are security logs." He didn't deny it again. Instead, he pivoted. "I was going to tell you. After things settled. After the baby was born." I asked. He flinched. That was the first time we acknowledged it out loud. "Natalie. Pregnant. Due in a few months?" He ran his hand through his hair, pacing slightly. "You don't understand how complicated this became." "I understand timing," I said. "And I understand intent." His voice softened. "Nicole, this wasn't supposed to hurt you." I almost laughed. "But didn't..." "It wasn't supposed to inconvenience you," I corrected. He stopped pacing. "You froze everything. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Yes. And you're okay with it?" "I'm okay with protecting my assets." There it was again, that word he hated. Assets. To him, it sounded cold. To me, it sounded responsible. "You're treating this like a business transaction," he said. "You turned it into one." Silence stretched between us. I remembered the night, months earlier, when I had asked him if he ever thought about starting a family. We were sitting on this same couch. He had said, gently, that he wasn't financially secure enough, that he didn't want to bring a child into instability. Now he was trying to move one across an international border using our joint savings. "I didn't plan for this," he muttered. "No," I said. "You reacted." He sat down finally, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Natalie didn't know about the joint account," he said. "She thought it was my personal savings." I studied him carefully. "So you lied to her too?" He didn't answer. For a moment, I felt something almost like relief. Not because he was caught, but because the illusion was gone. He wasn't a mastermind. He was a man scrambling to preserve an ego. "Why Canada?" I asked. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Different jurisdiction. Less immediate pressure." "You researched that?" "A little. Not enough. Apparently, I wasn't trying to steal from you," he said. "I was trying to avoid a war." "You avoided a conversation," I replied. He stood abruptly. "What do you want?" "Nicole." The question wasn't emotional. It was tactical. "I want full financial disclosure." I said. I want the transfers documented. I want access to every account tied to that vendor shell. And I want you to stop pretending this is a misunderstanding. He stared at me as if I'd spoken another language. You'd really drag this through court? If necessary. This will ruin my career. I held his gaze. You forged my signature. The truth didn't need volume. He looked away first. Can you at least release the freeze until we sort this out? He asked quietly. Natalie has doctor appointments. You should have considered that before rerouting funds. You're punishing a pregnant woman. No, I said. I'm holding you accountable. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it and swallowed. Natalie's freaking out, he said. She thinks she might lose her travel clearance entirely. I didn't respond. He looked at me again, searching for softness. There's still time to fix this privately, he said. We can settle. Quietly. I'll walk away. No claims on the condo. No fight. And what about the money already moved? I'll pay it back. With what? That question landed harder than the others, because he didn't have an answer. The firm he worked for had already requested a compliance meeting. Word travels fast when forged authorizations hit regulatory flags. You don't have to destroy everything, he said. Almost pleading now. I'm not destroying anything, I replied. I'm removing my exposure. For the first time since he walked in, he looked small. He glanced around the condo, the furniture we chose together. The artwork I bought after my first major consulting win. The city skyline outside the windows. You were supposed to be on my side, he whispered. I said, until you decided to move my money behind my back. He stood there for another moment, as if waiting for something dramatic, tears, yelling, maybe even forgiveness. There was none. Finally, he picked up his keys again. Where are you going? I asked. To figure out damage control. The phrase almost made me smile. As the door closed behind him, I sat back down at the kitchen island. I didn't feel victorious. I felt precise. Daniel thought the airport was the crisis. It wasn't. It was just the notification. The real consequences were only beginning to calculate. 2 nights after the airport, I stood in a ballroom overlooking the Chicago River, smiling at investors who had no idea my marriage was disintegrating in compliance reports. Crystal chandeliers reflected against glass walls. Waiters moved quietly between tables. A panel discussion on distressed real estate capital had just ended, and I was scheduled to moderate the closing Q&A. My phone buzzed in my clutch. Daniel, we need to fix this. I locked the screen without reading the rest. I stepped onto the stage and began speaking about liquidity, leverage, and restructuring strategies. My voice was steady, my posture precise. If anyone in that room had looked closely, they would have seen a woman completely in control of risk exposure. They would not have seen the ultrasound invoice saved in a folder labeled evidence. The confirmation had come 3 weeks earlier. The forensic accountant I hired had flagged a clinic payment routed through the same Florida shell account Daniel used for consulting travel. The clinic specialized in prenatal care. The invoice carried a patient ID. That ID matched a secondary insurance inquiry submitted under Daniel's employer coverage. Estimated due date. I stared at that line for a long time. Not because I was shocked. Because it confirmed intent. Pregnancy meant timeline. Timeline meant planning. Planning meant I wasn't reacting to a mistake. I was responding to strategy. That night, after the gala, I drove home slowly instead of taking a car service. I needed the quiet. When I walked in, Daniel was sitting on the couch, scrolling his phone. Long event, he asked casually. Productive, I said. He nodded. Distracted. I watched him for a moment. His jawline sharper than it had been months ago. New cologne. A different haircut. Subtle changes. Like a man editing himself for a new audience. Months earlier, I had asked him if he ever imagined having children. We were in the kitchen, cooking dinner. He had laughed softly and said, "We're not stable enough yet. I don't want to bring a baby into chaos." At the time, I thought he meant finances. Now I understood he meant ego. I walked past him and set my bag down. "How's Natalie?" I asked evenly. The phone slipped slightly in his hand. "What?" "You heard me." His eyes hardened. "You've been digging." "I've been reading." He stood slowly. "You don't get to use that tone." "I don't need a tone." Silence. "You were going to tell me," I asked. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "Nothing ever is." "She didn't trap me," he said quickly, defensive. "It just happened. Biology tends to do that," I replied. His shoulders tightened. "You act like this is some corporate audit." "It is." He laughed bitterly. "This is my life." "And mine," I said. "And you funded it with joint assets." He ran his hands through his hair again. He did that when cornered. "She makes me feel—" He stopped. "Important." I finished. He didn't deny it. I remembered the first time I saw Natalie in person. It was at an open house event Daniel's firm hosted for prospective clients. She stood near the refreshment table, soft-spoken, admiring his design renderings like they were museum pieces. When he introduced her, he said, "A friend." She looked at him like he was a visionary. I had looked at him like he was my husband. The difference was validation. "She believes in me," he said quietly now. "I invested in you." I answered. He didn't respond. Over the next week, more details surfaced. A 6-month lease agreement in Toronto. A deposit paid in advance. An email exchange with an immigration consultant outlining temporary residency options for a young family. Young family. He was rewriting the narrative in real time. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't ask why I wasn't enough. I opened a legal folder instead. When I met with my attorney again, I didn't talk about heartbreak. I talked about exposure. "She's pregnant," I said. "That complicates jurisdiction," my attorney replied. "She's moving to Canada." "That complicates enforcement." I nodded. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want documentation airtight." That night, Daniel stayed out late. At 11:47, I heard him come in quietly. He whispered into his phone from the hallway. "We're almost there," he said. I stood in the kitchen, invisible in the dark. Almost where? Almost free. Almost relocated. Almost replaced. He didn't realize I wasn't racing him emotionally. I was pacing him legally. 2 days later, I received confirmation of the one-way tickets. Departure date confirmed. That's when I understood the full architecture of his plan. Relocate Natalie before the baby was born. Establish residency outside immediate scrutiny. File for divorce after assets were repositioned. Frame it as irreconcilable differences. He thought geography could erase paper trails. He underestimated how systems communicate. The night before the flight, he sat across from me at dinner. "You seem calm," he said. You're not going to make a scene." "I don't make scenes." He studied me like I was unfamiliar territory. "You think you're smarter than everyone," he muttered. "No," I said. "I just read contracts." When he went to bed, I stayed up. I reviewed the prenup clause again. Misuse of marital funds for undisclosed third-party benefit. Forfeiture of asset claims. He had signed it without reading the fine print. By the time Daniel believed he was stepping into a new life, I had already filed the paperwork that would make departure irrelevant. If pregnancy gave him urgency, it gave me leverage. He thought the baby was the turning point. He was wrong. The turning point was the forged signature. The document should not have existed. It was buried inside a batch of routine transfers my forensic accountant forwarded late on a Thursday night. Labeled simply, "Review this." I opened the PDF expecting another small routing adjustment or vendor discrepancy. Instead, I saw my name at the bottom of a wire authorization form, approving a significantly larger transfer than the monthly payments Daniel had been making. The signature looked like mine. Almost. If you sign contracts daily, you recognize your own rhythm. The loop in the H of Harper was too tight. The slant was slightly off. The timestamp at the bottom showed 11:16 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was in Boston at a client board meeting that morning. I had badge logs, calendar records, and hotel receipts to prove it. I stared at the page for a long time, not because I was shocked, but because I was impressed. He had studied it. He had practiced, and he believed it would hold. The amount transferred wasn't small. It was large enough to qualify as repositioning, not casual support. The funds had been routed first through a vendor labeled North Shore Design Consulting, then redirected into an account tied to Natalie. North Shore Design Consulting did not exist. I searched corporate registries again. Nothing. No registration. No tax ID. Just a temporary LLC formation request that had been abandoned. He had created a shell to mask a transfer. I didn't feel betrayed in that moment. I felt recalibrated. I called my attorney immediately. Forgery, he said after reviewing the document. If the signature is unauthorized, this crosses into financial fraud. There it was. Not infidelity. Fraud. Would that hold up? I asked. If you can prove you weren't present and did not authorize the transfer, yes, especially with routing concealment and the cross-border movement, that escalates compliance review. I closed my eyes briefly. Absorbing the weight of it, Daniel hadn't just lied. He had exposed himself. That night, he came home late again. I was sitting at the dining table with my laptop open. The forged document minimized on the screen. "You're still working?" he asked. "Always." He poured himself a drink and leaned against the counter. "You've been distant. I've been observant." He smiled thinly. "You're enjoying this?" "Enjoying what?" "Having leverage." I watched him carefully. "You think this is leverage?" I asked. "What else would you call it?" "Documentation." He scoffed. "You act like I robbed a bank. You forged my signature on a wire transfer." He froze. "Don't exaggerate," he said quickly. "I'm not." He set the glass down too hard. "You have no idea what pressure feels like," he snapped. "You win every deal. You control every room. I just wanted something that was mine." "Stealing isn't ownership," I replied. "It wasn't stealing. It wasn't yours." Silence filled the space between us. He looked almost offended that I wasn't shouting. "You're going to blow this up over paperwork," he said. "Paperwork is how ownership is defined." He ran his hand over his face. Exhausted. "I was going to fix it," he muttered. "With what money?" He didn't answer. The next morning, I revisited the prenuptial agreement. When we signed it before the wedding, Daniel had laughed lightly and said, "You really think I'd ever come after your money?" I had answered, "It's not about distrust. It's about clarity." He hadn't read it carefully. I knew because he had skimmed while distracted. The clause was simple. Any misuse of marital assets for undisclosed third-party benefit, particularly in connection with extramarital relationships, voids the violator's claim to division of certain shared property. I read it twice, then a third time. It was airtight. I met my attorney again that afternoon. "If we move forward," he said, "this becomes official. Asset freeze petition. Financial fraud inquiry. Compliance escalation. Will that trigger travel review?" I asked. "It can," he said carefully, "especially if cross-border fund movement is involved." I didn't ask him to hold anyone's passport. I didn't need to. I signed the documents initiating formal inquiry. By evening, the petition for temporary asset freeze was filed. Daniel didn't know yet. He was busy coordinating with Natalie about prenatal appointments and Toronto furnishings. That night, I overheard him on the phone again. "We just need to get there," he whispered. "Once we're there, it's simpler. Simpler." He believed geography simplified ethics. 2 days later, I received confirmation from the forensic accountant. There had been an attempt to route an additional portion of funds into a secondary savings account under Natalie's name, structured as future security. It had been flagged automatically due to timing inconsistencies. He wasn't just planning relocation. He was building an exit corridor. I sat at my desk and looked at the skyline outside my office window. Chicago glittered. Indifferent. Marriage, I realized, is like any partnership agreement. It only functions when both parties respect the terms. Daniel didn't break the marriage when he slept with Natalie. He broke it when he assumed I would never read the fine print. The night before the scheduled departure, I received a notification from compliance. Inquiry active. Review escalated. Travel documentation under evaluation. I closed my laptop gently. Daniel was in the bedroom packing the last of his clothes. He believed he had already secured his new beginning. He didn't realize he had left a signature behind that didn't belong to me. And signatures, when examined closely, tell the truth. The prenuptial agreement was printed on heavy cream paper, the kind meant to look ceremonial instead of defensive. I laid it flat across the conference table in my attorney's office and traced the edge with my finger. 5 years earlier, Daniel had skimmed it between wedding planning emails and dinner reservations. He had teased me about being dramatic. He had signed it anyway. Now the paper felt less like protection and more like prophecy. "You were thorough," my attorney said, adjusting his glasses as he reread the highlighted section. "I'm in risk mitigation," I replied. "It's what I do." He nodded toward the clause we both knew mattered most. Misuse of marital assets for undisclosed third-party benefit, particularly in connection with extramarital conduct, triggers forfeiture of claim to certain joint property. He violated it. My attorney said simply, "Clearly," I answered. "And with the forged authorization, it strengthens enforcement." I didn't smile. I just absorbed the confirmation. Outside the window, downtown Chicago moved with its usual precision. People crossed streets. Cabs idled. No one knew that inside this quiet office, my marriage had shifted from emotional dispute to contractual breach. "What's the timeline?" I asked. "His flight is in 2 days." "Correct." "Yes." "Then we file the emergency asset freeze petition immediately. And the financial fraud inquiry, already in motion," he said. "Your documentation was solid." I felt something settle inside me, not satisfaction, but alignment. Daniel had spent months planning a relocation strategy. I had spent weeks building a compliance framework. He thought he was escaping exposure. He was walking directly into it. That evening, I returned home before Daniel. I opened my laptop at the kitchen island and reviewed the shell entity records again. North Shore Design Consulting had been created using a temporary address and dissolved before it was ever operational. Sloppy. He was careful emotionally. He was careless structurally. When he walked in later, he looked almost energized. I confirmed the condo key pickup. He said casually, "They'll leave it with concierge." "For Toronto?" I asked. He paused, then shrugged. "It's just temporary." Temporary had become his favorite word. "Did you secure funding?" I asked lightly. He stiffened. "I told you. I handled it." "Yes," I said. "You handled it?" He didn't ask what that meant. Instead, he poured a drink and leaned against the counter. "You're awfully calm," he observed. "I prefer planning to panic." He laughed under his breath. "You think this is a game?" "No," I said. "I think this is documentation." The next morning, my attorney emailed confirmation. Emergency petition filed. Temporary freeze on joint assets requested pending full review. I stared at the words for a long time. This wasn't revenge. This was containment. Later that afternoon, I received a call from the compliance specialist my attorney had coordinated with. Cross-border fund movement tied to joint account irregularities triggers automatic reporting flags, he explained, especially when there's evidence of unauthorized authorization. And that affects travel. I asked carefully. "It can prompt documentation review," he said. "Not always, but often enough." I didn't ask him to do anything else. I didn't need to. Daniel came home that night unusually confident. "I think you're bluffing," he said suddenly, standing in the living room with his phone in hand. "About what?" "You wouldn't really drag this into court." "It would hurt you too." "In what way?" "Public record? Reputation? Drama?" I almost smiled. My reputation is built on enforcing agreements. He stared at me like he didn't recognize the woman in front of him. I thought you were different, he muttered. I am. His phone buzzed. He glanced down and frowned. What? I asked. Nothing, he said too quickly. He disappeared into the hallway and whispered into the phone. We're still on schedule, he said quietly. Don't worry. I stood in the kitchen and imagined Natalie packing her own suitcase, folding maternity clothes, believing she was stepping into a stable future. I didn't hate her. I pitied her miscalculation. The next morning, confirmation arrived. Asset freeze order granted pending hearing. Joint account access restricted. Notification sent to financial institutions. I exhaled slowly. Daniel didn't know yet. He was still finalizing airline details, messaging Natalie about flight times, reassuring her everything was under control. He had no idea that control had already shifted. That night, he laid 2 printed boarding passes on the kitchen counter. See, he said. All set. I looked at them calmly. One way. Toronto, departure. 6:45 A. Emma. You're confident, I said. I've thought this through. Have you? He narrowed his eyes. You're not going to show up at the airport and make a scene. Are you? I don't make scenes. He studied me again. Uneasy. You think you're smarter than me? He said. No, I replied. I just read the fine print. He didn't understand then that the passport was never the first move. The first move was the clause he never read. The second move was the signature he thought I wouldn't notice. The third move was letting systems do what systems are designed to do. By the time Daniel believed he was stepping into a new life, every structure he relied on was already recalculating his access. He thought departure was freedom. He forgot that contracts travel faster than airplanes. I woke before my alarm the morning Daniel was supposed to leave. The sky over Chicago was still dark, the city quiet in that fragile space before traffic and noise take over. I lay still for a moment, listening to the faint rustle of fabric in the hallway. He was up. By 5:15, I heard the soft roll of suitcase wheels across hardwood. He moved carefully, as if silence could disguise intent. I sat up, checked my phone, and opened my email. Asset freeze confirmed. Compliance inquiry active. Travel documentation under review. 3 short lines. No drama, no exclamation points, just systems doing what systems are designed to do. Daniel paused outside the bedroom door before entering. You're awake, he asked lightly. I have an early call, I replied. He nodded, adjusting his jacket. He looked freshly shaved, composed, almost optimistic. I'll be back in a few days, he said. Just meetings. In Toronto, I asked. Yes. He held my gaze a second longer than usual, searching for something, fear, perhaps, accusation. I gave him neither. Safe flight, I said. He hesitated, then leaned down and kissed my forehead. The gesture felt theatrical. By 5:45, the front door clicked shut. I didn't follow him. I didn't rush to the window. I didn't check the tracking status of the flight. Instead, I poured coffee and waited. At 6:12, my phone vibrated. Transaction attempt declined. Merchant. United Airlines. Amount. Seat upgrade. I took a slow sip. 6:14. Second transaction attempt declined. Different card. Same result. At 6:18, the first call came in. Daniel. I let it ring. It stopped. Started again. I placed the phone face down on the counter and walked to the living room window. The skyline was turning pale gold. 6:23. A text. What did you do? 6:25. Another call. This time I answered. What's wrong? I asked calmly. What's wrong? He repeated, his voice tight. My cards are frozen. All of them. They're saying there's a review on the account. Yes, I said. Yes. His voice cracked slightly. Yes what? Yes. There's a review. This isn't funny. Nicole. I'm not laughing. In the background, I could hear airport announcements echoing. Natalie's voice, faint and anxious. They pulled her aside, he said quickly. They're saying her passport is flagged pending financial inquiry. What does that even mean? It means there's an inquiry, I replied. You triggered this. I documented irregularities, I said. Systems triggered the rest. He inhaled sharply. You can't just stop us from leaving. I didn't stop you from leaving, I said evenly. I stopped you from moving my money. Silence. Then, lower. Angrier. You're punishing a pregnant woman. I'm holding you accountable for forged authorization and cross-border fund movement. God. You sound like a robot. Emotion doesn't change transaction logs. In the background, I heard Natalie's voice rise. They won't let me through, she said. Louder now. Daniel. What's happening? Give me a minute. He snapped at her. He returned to me, voice trembling slightly. Fix it. It's under review. Call them. It's not how it works. You did this on purpose. Yes. There it was. The first honest moment of the morning. You're ruining everything, he said. No, I replied. You did that when you forged my name. He exhaled heavily, like someone realizing the floor had dropped beneath him. They're saying the ticket is non-refundable under these conditions, he muttered. And the condo deposit was paid with joint funds, I said, which are currently frozen. You're unbelievable. I read the contract, I answered. There was movement on his end. Voices. A sharper tone from airport security. They're telling her she can't board until the financial review clears, he said. Panic creeping in. Do you have any idea what this looks like? Yes, I said softly. It looks documented. He lowered his voice. We were almost there. I know. That silence again. This time heavier. You think you've won, he said. This isn't about winning. Then what is it about? Consequences. A long pause. Then he asked the only question that mattered. What do you want? I want full financial disclosure, I said. I want the forged transfer addressed. I want the misuse of marital assets acknowledged. And if I don't, then the review continues. He let out a short, disbelieving laugh. You're destroying my career. You destroyed it when you signed my name. Another announcement echoed through the phone. Final boarding call. He wasn't on it. Natalie's crying, he said quietly. I didn't ask her to lie. You're cold. I'm precise. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, this has gone too far. It went too far when you booked one-way tickets. He hung up. I stood in the kitchen, coffee now cold in my hand. I didn't feel triumph. I felt stillness. At 6:45, the flight departed without them. At 7:10, I received an email notification from Daniel's firm. Subject: Compliance inquiry, immediate review requested. The systems were talking to each other now. By 7:30, the sun was fully up over Chicago. Daniel thought the airport was the crisis. It wasn't. It was the notification that his exit strategy had no funding. And for the first time since this began, he understood that I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was enforcing structure. Daniel didn't come home that night. I expected that. The airport had been a public fracture. Men like Daniel don't rush back into the house where the damage originated. They look for neutral ground. Hotels. Friends' couches. Anywhere that doesn't remind them of miscalculation. I woke the next morning to an unusual quiet. No coffee brewing. No shower running. No low hum of frustration drifting through the hallway. Just my phone lighting up with notifications. At 8:14, an automated email from our joint bank confirmed expanded review under compliance escalation. At 8:32, another notification. Access to online account features temporarily restricted pending investigation. At 8:46, a calendar invite appeared in Daniel's shared work account. Subject: Urgent, financial irregularities review. Location: Conference Room B. Time: 10 a.m. I didn't forward it. I didn't screenshot it. I simply noted the time. Daniel finally called at 9:20. His voice sounded thinner. They suspended my system access, he said without greeting, until this is resolved. I see, I replied. You see? He repeated bitterly. You're monitoring everything. Aren't you? I'm protecting my exposure. They're questioning me about the transfer. They used the word fraud. It applies. God. Nicole. There was noise in the background, office voices. A door closing. They reassigned my Riverside project, he said quietly. Do you know how long I worked on that? Yes. It's temporary, he insisted. They said pending review. Compliance reviews rarely feel temporary, I said. You're enjoying this? No. Silence. I never meant for this to touch my firm, he muttered. You routed funds through your employer insurance coverage. I was trying to help her. With my money. He exhaled sharply. You don't have to destroy my entire life. I'm not destroying it. You froze everything. I froze joint assets. That's everything. That statement lingered. If joint assets were everything to him, then the plan had never been independent. After the call ended, I made a second appointment with my attorney. We need to expand documentation, I said. His firm is now involved. That increases exposure, he replied. If his employer reports to regulatory authorities, this could extend beyond divorce. I understand. Are you prepared for that level of escalation? I didn't escalate it, I said. He did when he forged the authorization. By midday, Daniel's mother called. Her voice was sharp, defensive. What have you done to my son? She demanded. I documented financial misconduct, I said evenly. You're humiliating him. I'm protecting myself. He made a mistake. He forged my signature. She paused, then lowered her voice. You're going to ruin his career over a woman. No, I said calmly. He risked his career over a forged document. She hung up without saying goodbye. That evening, Daniel showed up at the condo unannounced. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, shirt wrinkled, shoulders tense. They're reviewing my license, he said immediately. If this goes public, it's already documented. He stepped inside without waiting for invitation. You could stop this, he insisted. You could withdraw the inquiry. I can't withdraw transaction history. You know what I mean? I won't. He paced across the living room. Natalie's freaking out, he said. Her doctor won't confirm coverage without stable payment. She's talking about getting her own lawyer. That's her right. You turned her against me. I exposed you. He stopped pacing and looked at me directly. You don't even seem angry. I said quietly. When I saw the forged signature, he swallowed. It wasn't supposed to go this far. It always goes this far when paper is involved. He ran his hands through his hair again. A familiar gesture. They're talking about reporting obligations, he said. If my firm files anything, it becomes regulatory. Yes. That could follow me forever. So could fraud. He stared at me as if waiting for mercy. I'll give up the condo, he said suddenly. I won't fight the divorce. I'll sign whatever you want. Just stop the investigation. It's not negotiable. You're being vindictive. No, I replied. I'm being consistent. His phone buzzed. He glanced down and stiffened. What? I asked. It's Natalie. He answered. What now? He snapped. Her voice was loud enough that I could hear fragments. You said we were secure. You said you had savings. They won't clear the account. What am I supposed to do? He closed his eyes briefly. I'll fix it, he told her. How? She demanded. He had no answer. He ended the call slowly. She thinks I lied, he said quietly. You did. He looked at me, something cracking behind his eyes. You've made me the villain in every room, he said. I didn't create the paper trail. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. This will ruin all of us. I held his gaze steadily. It already ruined us, I said. He stood there for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he said, "You think you're untouchable?" "No," I replied. "I think I'm prepared." The door closed behind him. That night, I received confirmation that the court had scheduled the temporary orders hearing. Asset freeze upheld pending full review. Discovery expanded. Daniel thought the airport was the moment everything collapsed. It wasn't. Collapse is slower. It happens when illusion loses funding. And Daniel had just realized he no longer controlled the account. I chose my office for the confrontation. Not our condo. Not a cafe. Not his firm's lobby. My office had glass walls, a skyline view, and a conference table large enough to separate emotion from evidence. If he wanted to talk, we would talk where contracts lived. Daniel arrived 10 minutes late. He looked like he hadn't slept. His tie was slightly crooked. His confidence, once effortless, now strained at the edges. "You didn't have to do this here," he said as he stepped inside. "Yes, I did," I replied. I didn't offer him coffee. I didn't offer him comfort. I placed a folder on the table between us. The tab read documentation. He stared at it like it might detonate. "This is unnecessary," he said. "We can handle this privately." "We are handling it," I said calmly. He sat down heavily. "Nicole, listen. This has gone too far. It went too far when you forged my signature." His jaw tightened. "You keep saying that like I committed a crime." "You did." He exhaled sharply. "I was under pressure." "Pressure doesn't rewrite handwriting." Silence stretched between us. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Natalie is pregnant. That's not abstract. That's real. You're punishing a child before it's even born. I'm holding you accountable. She didn't ask for this. Neither did I." He looked away. "She believed me," he said quietly. "She believed we were stable. You let her believe that? She makes me feel important." I finished again. He flinched. I opened the folder and slid the first document across the table. Wire authorization. Timestamp. My forged signature. He didn't touch it. "That's not proof of intent," he said. "It's proof of action." I slid the second document forward. The Florida Shell Entity registration. Then the third. The Toronto lease agreement. 6-month term. Deposit paid with joint funds. His eyes flicked over each page. "You went through my email," he said. "I went through shared financial records. You invaded my privacy. You used my assets." His shoulders slumped slightly. "I was going to fix it," he said. "With what money?" He didn't answer. I placed the final document in front of him. The prenuptial agreement clause. Highlighted. He stared at it longer than the others. "You never cared about this before," he said. "I always cared about it. You didn't act like it." "I didn't need to." He leaned back in his chair, running his hand over his face. "You think you're morally superior?" he muttered. "No," I said. "I think I'm contractually protected." His voice sharpened. "You triggered a passport review. I triggered a financial inquiry. You knew what that would do." "I knew systems respond to irregularities." He stood abruptly. "You humiliated us at the airport." "I wasn't there." "That's worse," he snapped. "You did it remotely." "I documented it remotely." He paced once around the table, then stopped. "What do you want?" he asked again. "I want full disclosure of all accounts tied to North Shore Design Consulting. It's not active anymore." "That's not what I asked." "And then what?" "Then the court decides." His eyes widened slightly. "You're really going to court?" "Yes. You'll drag Natalie into testimony, if necessary." "She's 8 months pregnant. You involved her when you involved joint funds." He stared at me as if searching for a crack in my composure. "There's still time to settle," he said. "Softer now. I'll give up claims. I won't fight the divorce. Just withdraw the fraud angle." "It's not an angle. It will destroy me." "You destroyed yourself." He clenched his jaw. "Natalie is talking to an attorney. he said suddenly. She says I misrepresented my finances. Did you? He didn't answer. If she files independently, he continued, I'll be exposed on 2 fronts. That was your design, I said. You built 2 parallel narratives. He looked genuinely shaken now. You're not even angry, he whispered. I was angry, I said quietly, when I realized you assumed I wouldn't notice. That's not fair. It's accurate. He dropped into the chair again, staring at the skyline behind me. I thought you'd fight emotionally, he said. I thought you'd yell, cry, something. I don't perform collapse. He let out a hollow laugh. You're colder than I realized. No, I replied. I'm clearer. He sat in silence for several seconds. Finally, he said, if this goes public, my firm won't stand by me. That's between you and your employer. You won't even try to protect me. I protected us, I said. You opted out. He stood slowly. So this is it, he said. This is documentation, I replied. He picked up the folder, then set it back down without taking anything. For what it's worth, he said. I didn't think you'd go this far. For what it's worth, I answered. I didn't think you'd sign my name. He looked at me one last time, something between regret and resentment in his expression. Then he walked out of the office without another word. I remained seated for a moment, staring at the empty chair across from me. For the first time since this began, Daniel understood something essential. I wasn't trying to hurt him. I was removing myself from the damage. The courthouse smelled like polished wood and old paper. I arrived 20 minutes early, dressed in a white tailored suit that fit like intention. My attorney met me near the security checkpoint, briefcase in hand, expression calm. Daniel stood across the lobby with his lawyer. He looked thinner than he had weeks earlier. Natalie sat on a bench nearby, one hand resting protectively over her stomach, eyes fixed on the floor. We didn't acknowledge each other. Inside the courtroom, everything felt procedural, neutral, indifferent. That was the beauty of it. The judge entered, and we rose. Temporary orders hearing, asset freeze review, financial misconduct allegations. The words were clinical, almost detached from the chaos they represented. Daniel's attorney spoke first. This is a marital dispute that has escalated unnecessarily, he began. My client acknowledges poor judgment but denies criminal intent. Poor judgment. I didn't react. My attorney stood next. This is not an emotional claim, he said evenly. This is a documented financial irregularity involving forged authorization and cross-border fund movement. He handed up copies of the wire transfer forms. Timestamp, signature, routing path. The judge adjusted her glasses and examined the documents carefully. Mrs. Harper, she said, looking at me. You are stating you did not authorize this transaction. That is correct. And you were not present at the time of authorization. I was in Boston at a client board meeting. Security logs and travel records are included in the submission. She nodded slightly. Daniel shifted beside his attorney. This was not malicious, he interjected suddenly. I was under personal stress. The judge raised a hand. You will speak through counsel, she said. Natalie's attorney requested permission to be heard regarding potential child support considerations. The judge allowed limited input. Natalie avoided looking at me. She looked exhausted. When the forensic accountant took the stand, he walked the court through the transaction trail step by step. Joint account. Shell entity. Transfer to third-party account. Attempted offshore routing. It is your professional opinion, my attorney asked, that this transfer was structured to obscure the origin of funds? Yes, the accountant replied. Daniel's attorney stood. Is it possible this was a misunderstanding between spouses? No, the accountant said calmly. The use of a shell entity indicates concealment. The word landed harder than I expected. Concealment. Daniel's jaw tightened. His attorney pivoted. The passport issue at the airport, was that directly requested by Mrs. Harper? My attorney answered before I could. No. Travel review was triggered automatically after financial compliance flagged cross-border movement tied to an active inquiry. The judge looked at Daniel. So the travel restriction was a byproduct of financial review? Yes. Your Honor, my attorney confirmed. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if that detail alone had carried hope. It didn't. The prenuptial agreement was entered into the record next. The relevant clause was read aloud. Misuse of marital assets for undisclosed third-party benefit connected to extramarital conduct voids claim to division of specified joint property. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Daniel's attorney argued that the clause was overly punitive. The judge disagreed. It appears clear and mutually signed, she said. Enforceability will be considered at full hearing, but preliminary review supports its application. Daniel looked at me then. Not angry, not pleading, just aware. Natalie's attorney spoke briefly about financial stability for the unborn child. The judge acknowledged the concern and noted that child support considerations would be addressed separately from marital asset division. 2 tracks, 2 exposures. Daniel sat between them. After a short recess, the judge delivered interim rulings. Asset freeze upheld pending full evidentiary hearing. Expanded financial discovery ordered. Temporary restriction on Daniel's access to joint accounts maintained. Court date scheduled. The gavel struck lightly. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed with low conversation. Daniel approached me carefully. This doesn't have to go further, he said quietly. We can still settle. You can propose terms through counsel, I replied. You're destroying my reputation. You forged my signature. He looked at the floor briefly. My firm had someone in there, he said. They'll report back. That's not my decision. Natalie passed us then, avoiding eye contact. Her attorney guided her gently toward the elevator. For a brief second, I felt something unexpected. Not pity. Perspective. She had believed in a future that was funded by numbers she never saw. Daniel lingered another moment. You never fight emotionally, he said. It's terrifying. I don't fight, I answered. I document. He shook his head slightly, as if trying to understand a language he never learned. Then he walked away. I exited the courthouse alone. The Chicago skyline stretched ahead, bright and sharp against the afternoon light. My phone buzzed in my hand. An email from a major real estate development firm. Subject: Proposal Confirmation, European Expansion Advisory. I paused on the courthouse steps and read it once. Then again. While Daniel was fighting to salvage what he had misused. My career was moving forward. Not because of him. Not in spite of him. Just forward. He thought the airport was the turning point. It wasn't. The turning point was the moment his forged signature entered public record. And once something is recorded in ink, it doesn't disappear. It becomes history. The final hearing began at 9 o'clock sharp. I arrived early again. The same white suit pressed and unwrinkled. My hair pulled back neatly. The hallway outside the courtroom felt quieter than before, as if even the building understood that something permanent was about to be decided. Daniel stood near the window with his attorney. He looked older than 35 now. Thinner. The sharp confidence he once wore like a second skin had been replaced with something defensive and brittle. Natalie sat several seats away, her posture careful, her expression guarded. The distance between them was no longer subtle. When the judge entered, the air shifted. This wasn't a temporary order. This was determination. My attorney began with the financial summary. Total transfers traced. Total amount misused. Timeline aligned with pregnancy confirmation and lease agreement in Toronto. The forensic accountant returned to the stand to confirm findings under oath. The signature on the wire authorization, my attorney asked. Was it consistent with Mrs. Harper's verified samples? No. The expert replied. There were structural inconsistencies. Is it your professional opinion that the signature was not authentic? Yes. Daniel's attorney rose quickly. My client acknowledges signing on behalf of his spouse under marital assumption, not with malicious intent. The judge looked directly at Daniel. Did your spouse authorize you to sign her name? Daniel hesitated. No, he said finally. The word hung in the courtroom. Did you disclose the transfer to her at the time? No. Did you structure the payment through a shell entity? He swallowed. Yes. There was no dramatic reaction from the gallery. No gasps. Just documentation becoming record. Daniel attempted to explain. I panicked. He said, Natalie was pregnant. I didn't know how to tell my wife. I thought if I could secure temporary stability first, I could handle the rest. Temporary stability funded with joint assets. The judge asked. Yes. You believed that would resolve conflict. I believed it would prevent escalation. The irony was almost elegant. Natalie's attorney requested permission to address the court regarding child support expectations. She stood carefully, one hand resting near her abdomen. I was told funds were personal savings, she said quietly. I did not know about joint accounts. The judge nodded. That will be considered in separate support determination, she said. Daniel looked between us. Isolated in the center of consequences, he had tried to split into compartments. The prenuptial agreement was addressed next. The clause was read again. Clear language. Mutual signatures. Explicit forfeiture terms tied to misuse of marital funds in connection with extramarital conduct. Daniel's attorney argued mitigation. He did not anticipate this level of enforcement. The judge's response was measured. Failure to anticipate consequences does not invalidate contractual terms. I did not smile. I did not shift in my seat. I simply listened. After a brief recess, the ruling began. Asset freeze converted into formal financial judgment. Misused funds ordered repaid. Legal fees assessed proportionally. Claim to marital residence denied under prenuptial enforcement. Daniel's shoulders dropped incrementally with each line. Child support calculations were entered separately, based on his current income, already reduced due to suspension at his firm. He would be responsible for ongoing payments despite diminished earnings. Natalie stared straight ahead. Daniel looked down. The judge concluded with a final statement. This court does not adjudicate emotional betrayal. It adjudicates documented conduct. The record reflects misuse of marital assets and unauthorized signature. The gavel struck. Not violently. Not theatrically. Just decisively. Outside the courtroom, Daniel stood still for several seconds before turning toward me. You didn't have to take everything, he said quietly. I didn't, I replied. The contract did. You could have stopped this. I didn't forge my name. He ran a hand over his face. Exhausted. My firm terminated me this morning, he said. Effective immediately. I absorbed the information without comment. They're reviewing my license, he added. I'm aware. He gave a hollow laugh. You're aware of everything. I read disclosures. He looked toward Natalie, who was speaking with her attorney. She's filing separate support enforcement, he said. She says I misrepresented financial stability. Did you? He didn't answer. For a moment, something almost like regret flickered in his eyes. You never yelled? He said. No, you never cried. Not here. He nodded slowly. I thought you'd fight emotionally, he admitted. I don't fight emotionally, I said. I enforce boundaries. He looked at me one last time. You'll move on like this never happened. I'll move on because it happened. He turned and walked away. I stepped outside into the afternoon light. Chicago felt the same as it always did, busy, indifferent. Forward-moving? My phone vibrated. An email from the international development firm confirming the European Expansion Advisory contract. 7-figure engagement. I stood on the courthouse steps and read it twice. The court had finalized my divorce. But more importantly, it had formalized accountability. Daniel believed the airport was the worst moment. It wasn't. The worst moment for him was hearing his own admission entered into record. The system didn't destroy him. It documented him. And documentation, once filed, doesn't ask for forgiveness. It asks for repayment. The silence in my condo felt different after the verdict. Not empty. Clear. There was no tension humming beneath the walls anymore. No quiet suspicion. No late-night whispers in the hallway. Just space that belonged entirely to me. I moved Daniel's last unopened box into the hallway closet and closed the door without ceremony. The divorce papers were finalized, filed, and archived. The financial transfers had been repaid under court order. The joint accounts were no longer joint. For the first time in months, I slept through the night without checking notifications. Work filled the next weeks. The European expansion project accelerated faster than anticipated. I flew to London, then Berlin, advising on cross-border capital structuring for a real estate development group navigating regulatory compliance in multiple jurisdictions. I found it almost ironic. While Daniel had tried to manipulate borders to escape accountability, I was now building structures that respected them. In conference rooms overlooking unfamiliar skylines, I spoke about risk exposure, contractual safeguards, and documentation strategy. My clients listened carefully. They took notes. They asked questions. No one in those rooms doubted my competence. No one asked me to shrink to protect their pride. Back in Chicago, invitations began arriving. A financial compliance conference requested I speak about partnership asset protection. A Women in Business panel asked for insights on safeguarding long-term investments in personal relationships. I declined to share personal details, but I agreed to speak about contracts. Daniel's life filtered back to me indirectly, through mutual acquaintances, through public filings, through occasional child support enforcement notices that appeared in searchable records. His architectural firm had officially terminated him. The license review remained pending. He picked up freelance drafting work to cover ongoing obligations. Natalie had moved back to Ohio to live with her mother. She gave birth quietly. I learned that through a docket update tied to support proceedings. For a moment, when I saw the filing, I paused. A child had been born into the aftermath of adult miscalculation. I didn't feel anger. I felt distance. Natalie filed a separate claim asserting misrepresentation of financial security. She had believed Daniel's promises. She had believed the savings were his. He had told two women two different stories funded by the same account. Eventually, those narratives collided. I didn't monitor his life actively, but consequences leave trails. One afternoon, I ran into a former colleague of Daniel's at a networking event. He was brilliant, the colleague said quietly, but he made reckless choices. I nodded once. Recklessness looks different when it's documented. Months passed. Then a year. Then 2. The condo no longer felt like a shared space. It felt like a transition point. I sold it and purchased a smaller, cleaner property with no emotional history attached. I revised my estate planning documents, removed Daniel's name from emergency contacts, beneficiaries, digital storage access. It wasn't vindictive. It was final. At a development conference in New York, I met someone new. Not dramatic. Not immediate. A senior executive in infrastructure planning. Calm. Observant. Not threatened by silence. We spoke about cross-border investment strategy for 20 minutes before he asked a single personal question. I noticed the difference immediately. There was no insecurity in his curiosity. No need to compete. No subtle resentment when I described a deal I had closed. He respected structure. I respected that. The connection wasn't fireworks. It was equilibrium. Back in Chicago, I expanded my consulting portfolio. I launched my own firm by the 3rd year, specializing in high-risk partnership restructuring. I built it on the lessons I had lived. Every contract I drafted contained clarity where mine had been tested. Every client I advised understood documentation before emotion. 5 years later, I stood outside the glass building that housed my firm's headquarters. Founder and managing partner. My name etched into the directory. The morning air felt crisp. A notification popped up on my phone. An automated calendar reminder from years earlier, an old recurring entry that had once marked Daniel's planned departure date. I deleted it. Not angrily. Just efficiently. I didn't speak about him publicly. I didn't retell the story at dinners. I didn't warn people dramatically. I simply understood something I hadn't before. Marriage does not repair insecurity. Validation borrowed from someone else's admiration is unstable currency. And financial betrayal cuts deeper than emotional dishonesty because it assumes blindness. I wasn't blind. I was observant. One afternoon, I walked past the courthouse downtown. I didn't stop. I didn't look up at the steps where the verdict had been delivered. That chapter had closed. Daniel had believed I took something from him. In truth, I removed my access from his instability. And when you remove your resources from someone who relies on them, collapse feels like attack. It isn't. It's exposure. I adjusted the strap of my briefcase and crossed the street. The light changed. Traffic moved forward. So did I. 5 years later, I stood in front of the glass doors of my firm and saw my reflection before I saw my name. Nicole Harper, founder and managing partner. The letters were clean, understated, etched into brushed steel beside the entrance. No dramatic logo, no oversized branding, just precision. The air that morning felt sharp and bright. Chicago in early fall always carried a kind of quiet confidence. The city didn't apologize for its past. It just kept building upward. I walked inside, greeted by a receptionist who didn't know my history. Only my calendar. Board meeting at 10. European expansion update at 11:30. Compliance advisory call at 2. I no longer reacted to crises. I designed systems that prevented them. Sometimes, on mornings like this, I thought about that airport. About the way Daniel's voice cracked over the phone when the cards declined. About Natalie standing at passport control, confused and frightened. He had believed the passport was the obstacle. It never was. The obstacle was documentation. The real power wasn't in holding someone back. It was in understanding how structures work. By year 2 of running my firm, I began mentoring younger women in finance and consulting. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that centered my story, but in quiet conversations about contracts, about prenuptial agreements, about joint accounts and disclosure. Read every clause. I would say, not because I expected betrayal, but because clarity protects peace. Daniel's life continued somewhere parallel to mine. I heard through public records that he was still working contract-based architectural drafts. His license review eventually cleared. But the termination stayed on his employment history. He paid child support. Late sometimes. On time other months. Natalie returned to teaching in Ohio. Their child grew. I never wished harm on them. I never wished reconciliation either. There is a difference between revenge and boundaries. Revenge is emotional combustion. Boundaries are structural reinforcement. What I did wasn't dramatic. I didn't expose him publicly. I didn't scream in a restaurant. I didn't post screenshots. I documented. I enforced. I withdrew access. And when access disappears, so does illusion. One afternoon, during a panel discussion on financial risk mitigation, a woman in the audience asked me a question. How do you stay calm when everything feels like it's collapsing? I paused before answering. You separate emotion from documentation, I said. And you respond to what can be proven, not what can be felt. After the panel, she approached me privately. My husband has been moving money, she said quietly. I don't want to overreact. I didn't tell her to leave him. I didn't tell her to forgive him. I told her to gather records. Preparation isn't bitterness. It's protection. On the 5th anniversary of the airport incident, I woke up before sunrise again. Old habits. I made coffee and stood by the window overlooking the city. There was no panic in my chest. No anger. No lingering resentment. Just perspective. Daniel had tried to start a new life abroad. He thought geography could shield him from consequence. He forgot that systems don't operate on emotion. They operate on evidence. And I understood evidence. I didn't win because I was ruthless. I won because I was prepared. I didn't destroy him. I removed myself from the damage he created. As the sun rose over Chicago, I checked my schedule for the day and closed my laptop. If this story resonates with you, it's probably because you've felt that moment, the one where something doesn't add up. The late-night text, the unexplained charge, the quiet shift in behavior. Maybe you didn't scream either. Maybe you just watched. If you've ever chosen composure over chaos, if you believe dignity can be stronger than drama, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted him at the airport? Or would you have done what I did? Let the system speak. Share your perspective in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read. And if you want more stories about strength, accountability, and the kind of justice that doesn't shout but signs its name and walks away, stay with this channel. Subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't revenge at all. It's clarity. And clarity changes everything. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.